Excellent. Okay, thank you. So welcome, Josiah. Just a quick introduction to the members tuned in that perhaps haven't heard of you, and I can't believe there aren't many that haven't heard of you. But Josiah started and runs Hodmedods. This evening's talk is really an introduction to the business and what they do. I think we know Hodmedods for pulses in particular, but I'm sure there are other interesting things that you're involved with. And really interesting for us all, and it's something that we all have ambitions for, is to work with a company that generates value from regenerative farming practices and organic farming practices. So that's something that's really dear to our heart, and we're very often disappointed that produce from our farms that have been grown and cared for and produced in a different way from the normal conventional, some people like to call it agricultural production, gets tipped in a heap with everything else, and what we perceive as having some extra value gets lost. So we're really interested in hearing how Hodmedods overcome that and generate some extra value for farmer suppliers. So Josiah, can I hand over to you, please?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, thanks. David, before I start, how long do you want me to talk? What's the format? Sorry, I missed the beginning. So
an hour. I mean, you can do an hour, Josiah, if you've got an hour. 45 minutes with questions. Let's see how it goes. We're very flexible.
Brilliant. I'm flexible too, so that's good. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me to talk to you all. It's always exciting talking to a group of farmers. And I have to say, when we began Hodmedod, or when the idea of Hodmedod was kind of emerging, we used to go and talk to farmers about what we were proposing to do. And we were always the kind of after-dinner light entertainment, in that we were the guys with the mad idea that was really interesting to hear about, but was never going to work. And I think what's really interesting over the last 10 years is how things have changed in a way, and how there's a sort of an increasing and ever-growing awareness of, the fragility that is all around us, which is, I think, incredibly evident at this very minute. So I was going to talk a little bit about what motivated us to start Hodmedod, talk a little bit about how we work, because I think that's kind of particularly interesting to all of you, and talk a little bit about what it is that we want to be doing in the longer term, and how we feel that retail and wholesale and distribution and all those businesses that David was alluding to, who are part of the supply chain, as we tend to think of it, how they should be supporting regenerative agroecological production through retail models that communicate that value. So we'll talk a little bit about that and our hopes for change in that broader system. So starting right at the beginning, I'm a lot older than perhaps you all think. Or maybe I'm not. But I was born in the early 70s and grew up in that time when there was an increased awareness about resource constraints, with the oil crisis in the 70s, and then going into the 80s there was things like the hole in the ozone layer. There was increasing awareness about things like climate change, and as a child growing up in rural Suffolk, I became really interested in ecology, wildlife, the world around us, and I thought that I was going to go off and be an ecologist, and that was how I was going to save the world. As you do when you're very young, you have these rather grandiose ideas about what your life's work is going to be. So I went to university and started to be an ecologist, and halfway through I realized that it really wasn't what I wanted to do. It was quite abstract, and although I was incredibly interested in the kind of the biological science side of it, I was feeling that it was lacking a human dimension, and how we as part of ecosystems are critical, both in their degradation, but also in their sustenance and continuation. And I got really interested in kind of human development. And I went off actually and changed what I was interested in, and began to study international development with natural resource management. So that's looking very specifically at resource poor farmers in the global south, or in the majority world, or whatever you want to call it, and how they're managing their livelihoods. And they're largely through subsistence agriculture and some cash cropping, how it is exactly that they're generating an income. And what really interested me there was that there are a lot of what are called participatory tools being used to engage with those farming communities and those rural communities, to actually ask them what their aspirations were, how they wanted their livelihoods to function. And government departments like the Department for International Development, as was then, and NGOs were all using these tools to make inquiries into livelihoods in the global south. And what fascinated me was that we weren't using any of those tools in East Anglia. DEFRA were not using the same tools as DFID, and farmers weren't being asked directly how they wanted policy to be shaped or how they wanted rural development to happen. There was a very much a done to kind of attitude, and this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I became really interested in how we might affect change at home in our own communities, and what would allow us to challenge and tackle problems like climate change and resource constraints, and producing food and all the amenities that go with landscape and rurality. And I joined a small non-governmental organisation called East Anglia Food Link. And East Anglia Food Link was established to do a number of things. We supported farmers through organic conversion in the early 2000s. We worked with local authority procurement officers on sustainable food, so getting local food into schools and hospitals. And we did quite a lot of work with local and national government. So we did some work with DEFRA, but we also did some work with local councils and the old government office region, as was in East Anglia. And we got to a point with all of that work where we sort of hit a glass ceiling. You know, we get to 10% local food going into schools or hospitals, and no one's really interested anymore. The procurement officers feel like they've done their job. The elected members are happy because they can write a thing on a leaflet that goes home to schools and to parents. And it was sort of frustrating. And we began doing a lot more work with community groups, with groups of people who wanted to engage a little bit more with where their food was coming from, and seeing food as this sort of space for political action with a small p, not party politics, but the politics of our engagement with each other. And if you bring people together around food, that thing that, you know, classically we all do 3 times a day, then you can affect a lot of change in a community, and you can encourage people to engage with each other and with the world around them. And one of the groups that we began working with was a group in Norwich called Transition Norwich. And they are all interested in the transition away from a sort of fossil fuel economy and how we were going to tackle climate change and extinction. This was in the mid 2000s, 2008, 9. And they asked us to do a piece of desk-based research. They wanted to know whether a city the size of Norwich could feed itself from its hinterland. And that's a really interesting thought experiment. And we were really fired up by this. And we looked at land use, soil type. We looked at macro and micronutrient requirements for people eating. We looked at what was already being grown and where that might be being grown. We developed this huge kind of Excel workbook. It was a ridiculous exercise, looking back on it. But one of the things that became really clear was actually you could feed Norwich from its hinterland. And there are about 160,000 people in the city. It's quite a small city, but it has quite a big regional pull. And not only could you feed Norwich from this hinterland, but you could do that without necessarily compromising Norfolk's wider commitment to feed other larger cities and to feed people in other parts of the world. And that's quite kind of thought-provoking, fascinating, but underlying it was this fundamental structural change that would need to happen, because what was really clear is that in order to do that in a kind of low carbon, resilient manner, we need to be growing a lot more legumes in the rotation, both as a break and in lay, but also for human consumption. And we need to be eating less meat, which I know is always a tricky one to bring up, but we'd be looking at more extensive meat, livestock as a rotation, a function within a rotation for nutrient cycling, but probably a lot less meat being eaten on a daily basis by people in Norwich. We took that to the group, and they were interested and said, right, make it happen. We want to see this happen. And we set up 3 demonstration projects. We, on the edge of the city, where there would have been market gardens historically. They'd gone kind of 40, 50 years ago, really, in Norwich. And those market gardens would have fed the city. They would have supplied the markets and the restaurants. But that land, had a lot of promise value. It's been built on, and imports and the nature of what's happened in horticulture in the UK has meant that that kind of production just wasn't really viable. So we set up a 9-acre community supported agriculture project. So this is the idea where a community of people come together to grow their own food, and are involved in various different ways. So we run a project where there are 150 families, and they employed 2 part-time growers who overlapped, and they put in a lot of voluntary hours themselves. And it's a really nice sort of coming together project. And I would say that they still exist and they're still running. They do produce food, but I think the biggest lesson that the members of that CSA take from that CSA is how hard it is to produce food. And it brings a new kind of level of respect and understanding. When you go into the supermarket and see a 25p lettuce, that question is, how on earth is that possible? And I think even if a project like that only causes people to think in that way, it's quite a useful thought exercise. So we established the Community Supported Agriculture Project. The next aspect that we were interested in looking at, because we felt livestock were largely sort of handled already, and there was already quite a good local supply into a local abattoir. The next bit we were really interested in was cereals. And Norwich had at one time quite a significant milling capacity along the river. And that's now all sort of retail outlets and high-end flats and nice places to be, but not milling. So all of the cereals that are grown around the edge of the city now disappear off into feed or into bioethanol or into the big plant bakeries to produce bread that's then returned to Norwich. And what we were interested in is, could we set up a small mill in the middle of the city and take grain grown on the edge and mill it in the city and create a Norwich loaf? And the sort of received wisdom is that that's quite difficult, and that we might not have the right milling grade. And we spoke to some bakers who were incredibly enthusiastic about this, and essentially said, actually, we can make bread out of whatever you give us. We've got process flexibility. We're not a big bakery that has an on button and an off button at one end and the other end of a chain. We can adapt what we do, and we can produce a loaf. So we worked in particular with a baker called Stephen Winter, who runs a bakery called The Bread Source. We helped him set up a mill, and he still does work with farmers around the city producing bread from grains grown on the hinterland. And the final part of the project, which was also combinable crops, and in many respects was what we thought of as the most critical aspect of this work, was the nitrogen fixing, human consumption protein producing crops. So legumes or pulses, dried beans and peas. And it was the bit that we put off to the end. It was the bit that we thought was going to be most challenging. The idea that we would have to encourage or persuade people in Norwich to eat beans seemed like a real tall order. And I have to confess, we probably weren't very interested in pulses at that time. And we thought that we'd have to go to farmers and persuade them to grow lentils and chickpeas, because that's what everyone eats. And that would be really, really challenging. So we started talking to farmers, and inevitably they started telling us about the protein crops that they were growing, largely for animal feed. Blue peas, yellow peas, some marrow fats going to human consumption, and obviously field beans. And as we were researching this, we began to twig, which you will all have twigged years ago, we began to twig that there's this massive human consumption export market for field beans, for fava beans. And I have to admit that I'd always just assumed that they were not really a fit for human consumption pulse, and that the reason that we didn't eat them is because they were no good to eat. But the realization that there were people particularly in Egypt, Sudan, and the Middle East, who absolutely loved these beans, was quite extraordinary. So we went down the road to Ellingham Grain, who were just outside Bungay, bought half a ton of split fava beans, and they said, "What are you going to do with those?" And we said, "We're going to feed them to people in Norwich." And they thought it was absolutely hysterical that we would be proposing to do that. But we took them back and we started to cook some of the recipes that we had discovered were being used in places like Egypt. We made fulmadam, which is a really earthy, rich stew made of whole fava beans. We made falafel. So in Egypt, they don't make falafel with chickpeas; they make them with a split fava bean, and we couldn't believe it. They're absolutely delicious. And we realised that, you know, we in the UK developed very early, industrialised very early. We had a process of agricultural change, and we acquired an empire. And if you needed to eat those beans 400 years ago, you were poor, and they were very much a stigmatized food that that disappeared from the written sort of record. So having gone from being in the form of curry, which is a very high status 14th century cookery book, by the 18th and early 19th century, fava beans completely disappeared from cookery books. So we decided that we would get people in Norwich to eat them, but we also realised that we would need to really sort of make them appealing. So we found a local artist, and we asked her to paint us a little card and explaining what the beans were, and then on the back we paid postage paid and asked some very simple questions. And we put them all over Norwich, and we bagged up that half a ton of beans in William's kitchen. We used a bit of PTO shaft, which we tucked into the bag, and then we'd scoop it in on the scale. I assure you, we don't do that anymore, but we do still have the bits of PTO shaft because they're a nice kind of memento of this very primitive way that we went about it. We sealed them up with tape. We got them out into restaurants. We put them into some box schemes. We took them to events, and we gave them to shops to either give away or to sell. And we didn't know what would happen. We did know that we'd really enjoyed them, and we were really interested to see what would happen. And the cards just started to kind of pour back. Here are a few. You can't see, there's stacks more of them behind me up there. Amazing response. And we got hundreds and hundreds of these cards pouring through William's letterbox, which we then had to, because we promised we'd do something with the data, we then had to transcribe it all. And what's amazing is that we got such a positive response, and obviously people were self-selecting, so they were bound to reply if they were positive. But this is one randomly. How much do you like the beans? A lot. Would you buy the beans again? Yes. Have you eaten them before? No. How important to you is it that the beans are grown in East Anglia? Very. And then they've given us a recipe suggestion, and we thought, hang on a minute, we're really onto something here. So we approached, as we were coming to the end of the project work that East Anglia Food Link was doing with Transition City Norwich, we approached some local wholesalers and said, you know, we've got this thing that's happening here with these beans that no one eats. Would you like to try and sell them? And they said, no, that's not what we do. You know, we take things that already exist, and then we're a channel, a route to market for those things, and we sell them. We don't create a space for something completely new. That's a whole different job. And we approached a few, and we finally went to a national distributor, a whole food specialist called Suma Whole Foods. We're a co-op up in Halifax, and spoke to a fantastic woman called Deb Bedford, who's still our main contact at Suma. And we explained to her why we thought that they should be selling these beans. And she said, no, having heard you explain why we should be selling them, it's pretty clear to me that you should be selling them. And that was the moment really when we realized that we'd become absolutely passionate about these crops that were so critical for soil health, for human nutrition, and for lower input rotations, that we needed to begin selling them. So we bought another few tons from Ellingham Grain. We have to confess, packed them up in the same way, but we got Carol to make us a lovely box because we knew the beans needed to tell a story. This is an unfamiliar crop that people think is animal feed. So we put them in these rather pretty boxes, too pretty, quite expensive. And inside each one was the same bag as we'd previously done. But this time we also had a little recipe book, and a lot of the recipes were the recipes that we'd been given by those people in that original survey. So we had this fantastic response to those. We carried on doing work with East Anglia Food Link. We carried on doing some work with DEFRA and with other organisations. We did some work with farms about kind of value chain work that they were doing. And gradually, Hodmedod, this tiny business, this interest that we thought was important, began to grow and grow until in 2014, we took on our own space, a little unit in Halesworth, and we were at a point where we had the volume. We'd gone from that ton to buying 5 or 10 tons to 10 or 15 tons. And we were finally at the point where we could begin to approach farmers directly, which is what we'd always wanted to do, and say, we really want these beans grown and these peas grown, and we'd like them done in this particular way, and we like these particular varieties. And that was quite a watershed for us. It meant, for example, that we could begin to work on organic fava beans for human consumption. That simply wasn't happening previously. We worked with a farmer called Mike Stringer up in Yorkshire initially on that. And it meant that we could approach organic farmers and look at organic peas as well. So again, peas had always been going into the feed market, certainly for the best part of this century, due to very, very cheap Canadian organic imports. The opportunity cost and the risk of trying to grow peas organically in the UK just wasn't there. But if we were to approach a farmer and say, how much does it cost you to grow that pea? What return do you need? What are the risks associated with that pea? How can we help to mitigate those risks over a period of time? Would you be prepared to grow it? And of course, that's a very different proposition. And so our first farmer, who still grows for us, Mark Lee in Shropshire, initially he grew 4 varieties. He grew a whole blue, a whole yellow. He grew some Carlin peas, which are very tricky. They're tall and lax. I don't know if you've grown them, but they tend to fall over. They look beautiful when they're flowering, and everyone feels very optimistic and hopeful. And then they're all over the floor 3 weeks later, and no one ever wants to see them again. But Mark forgets each spring and then plants them. So, and every year he's beautifully optimistic about this year. He's got the intercropping mix right. The cereal that he's planted with them is going to be the structure that's going to change it. So he grew those, and he grew also marrow fat peas in that first year. And what became clear was growing 4 varieties of pea, although they might seem ostensibly to be the same thing, they're actually all very different, and that brought undue complexity to that system. So Mark now generally only grows 2 varieties of pea for us, yellow or blue, and the Carlin peas. And John Turner up in Lincolnshire grows our marrow fats for us. So we began to realize that we could develop these relationships with farmers. We can ask them to grow particular varieties of crops that already existed. We began to build relationships with processors. So people who could clean the beans or split the beans. We realized very early on that we might want to create this relocalized UK economy for pulses, but there was no way that we were, 1, going to be able to capitalize, or 2, had the skills to do all of the processing ex-farm, but that we could build relationships with people that had those skills. And initially that was very difficult because, for example, organic pulses were not being processed much in the UK. And the volumes that we had from Mark in the first couple of years were quite small. You know, they were less than a full load. And that's not very appealing if you've got a 100-ton silo that fills your cleaning line. So we had to build quite a lot of relationships with processors. And at the same time, we had to create a space for these crops on people's tables and on their plates and in their kitchens. You know, we naively thought, because the Norwich project had gone so brilliantly, that everyone would think these beans were wonderful. But of course, that's not the case, because if someone's not got us standing there, or hasn't got a little postcard, or isn't part of the project, they're not really going to pick those off the shelf. So a big part of our work in the first couple of years was getting them into the hands of food writers, restaurateurs, getting those beans normalized, getting them back into the culture and the tradition. We organized events. We were very proactive about, you know, visiting people like Hugh Fernie Whittingstall and getting him on side, and, you know, sending them out cold to anyone we could think of who might be interested in being an advocate. And everyone was really enthusiastic. So by 2015, we'd kind of established a market for the beans and peas that we were producing, and we began to realize that those kind of slightly wacky ideas, growing crops that weren't being grown in the UK, were actually completely feasible. And we had the volume and we had the confidence in our market to do that. And I think the really interesting thing about our market is that it's very, very diverse. So we're not trying to sell into the commodity market. We're not trying to grow any of these crops at an import substitution basis. We're not looking to compete with Canada or with Russia or with Australia on pulse production. We're just looking at a very particular specialist market with a small premium, that premium being British, or in some cases organic, which is a slightly higher premium. And because we have online sales from our bean store, all the way through, which go to home customers, all the way through to bigger retailers, it means that we can trial a crop. So if we want to learn how to grow lentils, and we're only going to produce 200 kilos in the first couple of years, instead of that first 200 kilos just sitting at the back of the shed, because how do you get it to market? We could sell it immediately. We could pack it up into little bags. We could understand what the consumer perception was, whether people wanted British lentils, how much they're prepared to pay for them. We could use that information to very quickly go back to the farmers and say, yeah, we think this is going to work. Let's expand the area. Let's go forward with this. So lentils are a case in point. We'd wanted to grow them. I went and did a talk at Lund University in Sweden, where I met some German farmers who were growing lentils. And I said, we'd like to grow lentils. And then I explained all the reasons why we couldn't grow lentils, you know, the agronomy of it, the market, the cleaning, the fact that no one grew them in the UK. And they said, those don't seem like good reasons. You just need to plant them. And then once they're in the ground, you can work the rest of it out. And so we did. In 2017, we harvested our first commercial crop. And we think it was probably the first commercial crop, certainly for a couple of 100 years. And the lentils are delicious. They are not easy to grow because they're so low growing, and there are problems with machinery and equipment, and there are risks. We have had complete failures. Last year was a disastrous year. So the first 3 years were very well, and then we've had some patchier years. But broadly, they work, and we've created a kind of a risk model with producing the lentils. So we pay a very significant premium. We're paying 2 or 3 times the global commodity price ex-farm for lentils in order to compensate for the risk of crop failure. And I think we started off with a 1 in 4 year failure. We haven't actually had quite such a high failure rate. But and then buoyed by the lentils, we've been looking at things like chickpeas. Again, these are crops that people are very familiar with. So they're a really easy sale for our customers because they really get it. And I think the other thing is that they really get that they're not grown in the UK. They imagine them as being, you know, a Mediterranean or a hot country crop. And they're absolutely right. They're a nightmare. But on a small scale, and to add colour to our range, very small areas of those crops work really, really well. We wouldn't want any of the farmers that we work with, particularly on lentils or chickpeas, to commit to huge areas. We don't have a big enough market. We need to be very, very conscious that demand should always exceed supply, and it's always the temptation when something goes well in one year to very quickly scale it up, and suddenly you've got a problem. So we've always been quite careful about making sure that we're building supply to match demand, so that we can ensure that we're making the right return to farm from that crop. That it's not, we don't want to get involved in a race to the bottom. For the lentils, for example, for the most of our farmers, they're growing more than 5 or 10 hectares feels quite risky, but that works fine for us. It's a volume that we can handle. It gives a lot of interest from a production point of view, and it's nice for us because it means we have lots of different farm names on the bags. We always put a farmer, you know, whoever's grown it, you know, their name goes on the pallets. Andy Howard. And as we began to develop these crops and understand, you know, what the opportunities were, farmers began to approach us with ideas that they'd had. So one of the first farmers to do that was Peter Fairs down in Essex, and Peter had been growing quinoa as a cover crop since the 1980s as part of Fair King Seeds, but he'd always wanted to grow it for human consumption. And when he first got hold of quinoa seeds in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, from ethnobotanist called Professor Colin Leakey. He was really, really excited. This is it's a complete protein. It's got all the amino acids you need, grows very well here. Wow, we should be eating loads of it. So he's got a lovely folder of clippings from the 80s where he went to trade shows and took the quinoa with him. But the thing that he'd perhaps not fully appreciated is that quinoa has a bitter seed coat, a saponin seed coat, which is really unpleasant to eat and needs to be washed off. That washing process is quite difficult because the saponins are toxic to aquatic life, so you need big settling pools, and it's just not practical in the UK. And his potential customers realised that quite quickly as well, because it was a real hassle rinsing the quinoa and getting all the foam out. And he never quite managed to do it properly, so there's always a bitterness. It's not very nice. So Peter, amazingly realising that, over the years, identified sweet quinoa growing in amongst his cover crop quinoa, selected those out, grew them separately, and by the early 2010s had a small amount of essentially a farmed developed mixture or population of quinoa, which we've been selling ever since. And we've been an incredibly useful route to market for him in exactly the ways I've described, in that we've been able to test the market for those crops. So when he had his first 4 tons and we didn't really know whether quinoa would sell, and it did. And we've offered him a kind of a volume sale that has given him the confidence to develop that crop and to continue working on it. And particularly things like the agronomy. How do you harvest quinoa? We started off and still sometimes Peter does swath, but using stripper headers, looking at direct combining, and knowing there's a market means you can experiment with those things and work out what the cost base needs to be. And we've subsequently really diversified our crops. So we've had farmers that are approaching us who are growing coriander, for example, for gin production in the UK. And gin production doesn't actually require much coriander, but you need to grow a larger area of it to make the whole thing worthwhile. So what do you do with all the spare coriander? It just sits around. We now buy that and we sell coriander, which we never anticipated doing when we began. We do things like dried flowers, for example, which can be grown as part of a rotation, a different part of the crop. And we work with a small farm in Cornwall called Trenell Fields, and they produce a whole host of tisanes, so things like nettle and lemon balm that you can make into infusions, but also herbs. They grow oregano, all sorts of other things. They've built themselves a special drying room, and we market their crops for them. And they would never have been able to make that step had they not have had a route to market. And our established route to market has then allowed them, on the back of that, to develop their own local sales. And that local sale is something that most of the farmers that we work with have done. So the kind of dealing with the sort of intricacies of a new crop or a new way of harvesting a crop has allowed them to think differently about their position locally. So Mark Lee, who grew peas for us right back in 2014-15, first time, was never going to grow wheat again. He couldn't stand wheat. It was a commodity that left the farm and it didn't really interest him. Now he is growing about 15 or 20 different varieties of wheat every year in strips and combining them in strips, because he's identified that there's this higher value market opportunity local to him for cereals with known provenance and really interesting eating properties. So they're lower yielding, but they're much higher value. And then in terms of the interest that brings him on the farm, there's a massive added value there. And I think that kind of added value, that non-economic added value, is really significant. So Mark, John Turner, most of the farmers, in fact, that we work with are just always delighted to see their name on a packet in a shop and see them mentioned, on social media or at events, or to feel where they were producing meat, which they mostly all do through their livestock, or where they were growing vegetables for local sales. They were quite used to that kind of feedback, but with combinable crops, which are completely anonymized and commoditized as soon as they leave the farm, that was quite an unusual experience. So that kind of new sets of economic relationships that they could develop is something that we've been able to foster by introducing them to potential customers as well, which is quite an unusual thing for a business to do. We're very transparent about where where all of our crops are grown. We're very happy for our customers to meet our producers, partly because we know that our relationships are very strong, so we don't worry about our farmer group, being poached, for example. That's not something that really bothers us in any way at all. But also because we know that those farms need more than one customer. It's critical that they have a diversity of customers, just as it's critical that they have a diversity of crops growing on the farm. So we need to create essentially these much more complex networks of supply. So rather than thinking of linear supply chains where you've got the food producer at one end, and then you've got a whole set of gatekeepers who are extracting value, but also often befuddling in terms of information, about provenance and about where it's come from. So that by the time it comes to the end consumer, there's not really a direct connection back to the farm. But if we think in a more network model where you've got farmers who are also consumers, let's not forget that we all eat as well as do the other things that we do, and researchers and journalists and food writers and restaurateurs and the processors, all of these community of people should be coming together to create essentially relational system of supply rather than something that's purely transactional. What's in it for me? How much margin am I going to make? Does not make for a sustainable long-term business. Whereas developing a relationship where, for example, ex-farm specifications, where there is some flexibility. The lentils are only grown for us. We're the only customer. If we get difficult about a specification, that doesn't really help anyone at all. So having a bit of flexibility and working out how to deal with issues as they arise and problems, but also looking at other opportunities, and that kind of open-mindedness leads to all sorts of other interesting things happening. So these, we're calling them wrinkled peas. So this is a chance conversation that's turned into a really interesting product. So Nick Saltmarsh, one of my co-founders, one of his friends farms in Suffolk, and they were looking at the bypass peas, the vining peas that had missed the cut. They weren't sweet enough, so they'd been left in the field. And Jason was going to harvest those, and they were going to go into animal feed. It was recovering something from nothing. We wondered what they were like to eat. And we began to talk to some of the researchers at the John Innes Centre at Norwich, and it turned out they were running a project on wrinkled peas. And most of the peas that we eat, most of the human consumption dry peas, are smooth. The wrinkled peas are wrinkled because they're extra high in resistant starch, and that resistant starch causes the pea to kind of crinkle up as it dries. And the resistant starch is incredibly good for our gut health because it's digested lower down in the stomach. It feeds a whole different set of gut microflora that don't get much nourishment, and they in turn are critical in preventing or alleviating or reducing the risk of things like type 2 diabetes. They're also associated with feelings of happiness, which is lovely. By feeding our gut microflora, we can make ourselves feel better, but also are good generally for brain health. So one of the things that resistant starch is increasingly being demonstrated to be good for is the prevention of Parkinson's disease, and there's quite a lot of work that's coming out of Canada on that. But no one's eating these peas. They're ploughing them in or they're feeding them to animals. So we've begun a project looking at creating a market for wrinkled peas and looking at whether there are commercial varieties that might grow a bit more like a round pea, but that are wrinkled. So by having these conversations, you can open up all sorts of really interesting opportunities. And us as this node in this relational system of supply allows us to tell those stories to our customers, who may be retailers or maybe chefs, and excite them about that. And the thing that we've increasingly begun to wonder is, why aren't more retailers doing this? Why aren't more retailers directly connecting their customers to farmers in a meaningful way? I don't just mean sticking a picture of a farmer on a packet of carrots that were grown on a different farm or whatever it is, or making up the name of a farm and sticking that on a packet of meat. Genuinely creating those connections. And we wondered, and we've been wondering, how Hodmedod as a business, what does our future hold in this? Are we going to expand and get bigger and bigger and bigger, or does getting bigger and bigger and bigger actually destroy the very thing that we've kind of come this far to create? Because you can only manage so many relationships. Or do we in fact need a network of similar businesses that work together collaboratively, they exchange crops and products and knowledge and information, but that they have their own groups of farmers that work with them? And I think that's probably the best model. But we don't really know how that's going to emerge. We've tried sort of mentoring some smaller initiatives in other parts of the UK. None of them have really come to much, to be honest, as far as it goes. I think that's partly because what we're doing takes quite a unique set of skills that the three of us had, and also quite a lot of work, which I think is quite tricky for people to do. You know, Nick and I have just been preparing pallets for loading first thing tomorrow morning that are going off for processing, and you know, it's not just nice things, it's all of the kind of work. And I think often brand managers and businesses that establish to sell things aren't really interested in that. They're interested in the pretty box and telling the story, but they're not really interested in what goes on behind that in terms of creating a new food system, which is really critical. So we do need this new generation of retailers that really want to engage with production in a meaningful way and support and enable change, because my goodness, we need change to happen. We've needed change to happen for 30 years, but it's becoming increasingly urgent and apparent. And you know, the immediacy of nitrogen fertilizer prices, for example, the immediacy of the impact of climate change, the uncertainty that brings, you know, the current crisis in the commodity market because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. These things feel like one-offs, but they're not. They're constant, and they're going to keep happening. And we do need to reimagine our food system in a more resilient way, in a way that's much more inclusive, brings more people into food production, both on the land, but also in food processing, but also engages consumers much more directly with this process of change. Consumer is a very passive word, and we shouldn't be passive about what we eat. We should be very much more engaged with it. And the idea around food sovereignty, this notion that one has some degree of control or autonomy in where your food has come from and how it's come from, that you're not simply a passive recipient of food or beneficiary of big business that's selling you things that probably aren't very good for you. We need to enable more of that, and government policy needs to reflect that as well. And there's a frustrating kind of, well, it's all frustrating, isn't it, really, frankly, but the inability of government departments to engage with each other around process of change. So, you know, DEFRA's future farming program, you know, they're great. There's talking the talk. It's all lovely, but are they really engaging with Department of Health, the Department of Education? You know, all these conflicting messages around public goods and, you know, the amenity value of the countryside that isn't connected with health and food. It's inexplicable to me, and I don't really know. I mean, I'm throwing this out to all of you lot, really. I don't really know how we make a change in that direction. And Hodmedod itself remains a very tiny business. We are 1.5, 2 million turnover business. We sell maybe in different formats, probably about 1,000 tons of grains, pulses and seeds, in everything from little tiny 250 gram bags all the way through to ton totes. And our principle, you know, we're an activist business. We're all about making a noise and trying to affect change. And we need lots of allies in order to do that. And being a business, being an enterprise has really helped. When we were working for the NGO, that was quite limiting because you're seen as a dilettante on the side. Whereas if you're actually doing it, it's much more useful, and it seems much more kind of real. It's a kind of manifestation of what it is that you're talking about. Back in the early 2000s, we go to farms and tell them what we thought they ought to be doing, which is awful. And they'd say, yeah, of course we know all of that, but where are we going to sell it? And being able to go to a farm and say, well, here's some ideas about some things that you could be doing in order to diversify the rotation and bring more value back onto the farm. And also we can help with that because we have the route to market that can deliver that for you, has been really kind of empowering both for us and for them. And we've had a lot of support from our farmer group through that process. So I guess that's kind of it, really. I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to have a broader discussion about what I think is the fundamental problem, which is in any given year in England, or in the UK, there's about 5 million hectares of arable land, and I'm not convinced that. Basically, I think a lot of it is a bit of a disaster, and we desperately need to transform it. And yet, at the same time, if you've got 1,000 hectares of Suffolk land, you're not going to sell all that grain at the farm gate. You're not going to sell it to the local bakery. You need big customers that can make significant inroads into those volumes, and you need them to pay a price that enables and allows you to make the transformation on your farm that you want to make. And the question is, how do we find those big customers that are going to support that transformation, which needs to be really fundamental. It's not just about stamping regenerative on the pack, it's about meaningful regeneration on the farm. And I don't know where those customers are, and I don't know how farmers come together in order to wake those customers up, whether it's by, I'd be really interested to know whether you, between you, are at base kind of having these conversations and wondering, where do we put those hundreds of thousands of tons of combinable commodity crops that are produced in any given county, and who's going to buy them, and who's going to be adding that little bit of value that enables positive change to happen. Because government and the public can talk about it all they want, but the interventions aren't going to be there for public funding forever. And we need a retail sector that's going to support that change without excluding anyone from the food system. And that's people that haven't got much money, frankly. And I think it's critical. And it's easy to say, we need cheap food to feed the poor. I fundamentally think that we need to ask why people are poor in the first place. They can't afford to eat good food. And, there's a whole set of structural issues there that need to be addressed. Why have we got all these food banks? And just diversing commodity or supermarket food waste, essentially, surplus, into food banks is not a way to address that problem. How do we change everything is what I'm really asking. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I'd be really interested to sort of have a broader conversation, though, and begin to think about what this all looks like.
How do we change everything? That is a really big question, isn't it? And I was sort of thinking, you've clearly made inroads into the markets and the sector that you do, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? And whilst we have always had cooking programs on television from Delia Smith and Fanny Craddock and Keith Floyd and whatever years ago, baking and cooking programs have never been more popular. So one hopes that people can now again cook with ingredients and have learned some of those skills. So does the demand have to come from the consumer that wants the more interesting type of ingredient to use in more interesting recipes, or does it have to come from yourselves or even the supermarkets? The bigger brand names that populate high streets and shopping centres throughout the whole country, and until product is available readily in places like that, does the demand not happen to be satisfied by us? I don't know quite how we move it on.
Yeah, I think building demand is obviously key. I think the supermarkets have this, they give the appearance of abundance and of diversity because they make so many different things, but they're usually using fundamentally the same kind of 5 commodity crops, whether it's, maize, rice, wheat, there's not soya, there's not much real diversity. And yet we know in agroecological or regenerative systems, we need to get as much diversity as possible onto the farm. And we need to find a market for that. We can't have dead spots in the rotation where we're not taking any, let's not beat around the bush. We need an agroecological return, but there has to be an economic return as well to allow that to happen. And so if you are diversifying your rotation, you've got to find a market for those crops. And that means finding a way to encourage people to eat them. I think people are interested and willing to eat them, but there's a lot more work to be done. And it's much easier for the supermarkets or for the suppliers of the supermarkets to have a very consistent, reliable commodity that they know they can go out onto the global commodity market and just buy. I mean, we run out of things. That's unheard of. We have a finite quantity of a given crop, and when it's gone, it's gone. It's very difficult to do that in the bigger space, where if you do that in the supermarket, you lose your shelf space and you're not going to get it back.
Okay. So questions from the it's really interesting and thought-provoking, and thank you for that. Yeah, questions from the wider group, please.
I've got a question. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask, but I've just been looking on your website actually, Josiah, and just looking at the split peas, because that's really intrigued me. So it says on there that you have to soak them for a very long time, 5 to 6 hours, I think I just read. But then you can freeze them afterwards. How does that work? Because that kind of seems counterintuitive to having a dried product, and then I suppose if you cooked it in something, made it into something.
So a lot of the pulses, I mean, one of the barriers to eating a whole food, and the best way to eat a pulse is whole. In fact, there's lots of splitting them up into protein and starches and things like that, and then recombining them into other things. But eating them as a whole pulse is a really great way to eat them nutritionally. But they do need to be, often they need to be soaked. Things like the split fava beans don't, but split peas benefit. They cook more quickly if you soak them. You don't have to, they cook more quickly. And we tend to recommend to people that that batch cooking them is one way to do it. If you've bought yourself a little ½ kilo pack, cook it all at once, soak it and cook it, and then freeze it in portions, and then you can just put it into whatever it is that you're cooking, and it just makes things a bit easier. Lots of things don't. I mean, lentils are fine. You just cook them from dry. They don't need to be soaked at all. And we do things in cans as well. And working with one of the last sort of UK canners, who are based just outside Manchester, in order to understand how to make some of these things a bit more accessible. And one of the other things we do, which makes them very accessible, which I'm eating them now, is we make them into snacks. So people who don't think they like beans and peas, often when they eat the snacks, they realize they do like them because they're crunchy and delicious. So yeah, so it's finding ways to make them more accessible. And you're right, there is a barrier around soaking and cooking. One of our friends, Jenny Chandler, who has written a fantastic book called Pulse, she always draws the analogy with mobile phones. She says, people always complain about having to soak pulses, but I bet they never forget to charge the mobile phone before they go to bed. And all you need to do is pour cold water over your pulses in the evening, and then they're ready to cook the next day. She's absolutely right. But we are all, very bad at planning those kinds of things. I appreciate that.
I'm very guilty of that. Thank you.
I think one of the other things that we've done a lot of, and you can see them behind, is just trialing lots of different things and working on a very small scale. The whole idea about the viability of these crops. Often they're dismissed because import substitution isn't a possibility, but that doesn't mean to say they can't be grown here as a kind of niche, high-value crop. So there are quite a lot of things: the Phaseolus beans, different varieties of lentils, a whole host of sort of minor cereals that are delicious and have all sorts of nutritional benefits. They're very interesting to grow. It's quite challenging sometimes, but they're not going to be high volume.
David, I can see that it's either Dougal or George Hosford has put his hand up if he wants to ask a question. You need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Apologies. Yeah, it's Dougal. That was fascinating, Josiah. Thank you. Do you sell to supermarkets is my first question. Which I don't think you do, but I'm not quite sure. And are the supermarkets the root of all evil? I personally think they are, because I think your idea, your philosophy that you don't mind running out of something is a philosophy that we've lost completely. We could go to the supermarket now, which is probably still open in Blandford, and we can virtually buy anything we want, which just leads to greed, because you normally end up buying 2 or 3 of each thing because they're on offer, and then 2/3 of them go to waste. And how do we get away from it? I mean, I just don't know, but we need to. I basically agree with everything you've said.
So I think, yeah, it's really interesting. So we don't supply any supermarkets, and there are a number of reasons for that. Partly because we don't want to be beholden to them, partly because we're a small business and it's quite hard to cash flow supplying a supermarket. You know, it can be a bit of a disaster and you end up factoring invoices and all that kind of thing. And having one very large customer like that would completely skew the emphasis of our business. We'd be chasing them, we'd be doing all their technical work, we'd be doing all of those things, and we wouldn't be thinking about all the things that we are doing and that we've just described. The crop trials would go out the window because we'd have one or two products that a supermarket really liked and they wanted it in 200 stores, and our whole life would be dedicated to making that happen. And that doesn't really interest us particularly. Are they the root of all evil? I don't know. I mean, we all use them, I think, is part of the problem. You know, and they've been supported by a system, you know, that the whole regional distribution centre model, you know, that is supported by an infrastructure that they haven't had to pay for. You know, so everything from easy planning consents historically all the way through to road building. You know, that's really favoured this model that has had a really deleterious effect on our communities and on our kind of high streets, and has, despite the fact that they seem to offer this huge diversity of global foods, has actually limited our access to a lot of the more diverse foods, and has been very reductive in what food we eat. So, you know, the food that gives us very immediate gratification and pleasure, that's often high fat, high salt, high sugar, very, very readily available carbohydrates. And we do need to find a way of moving away from that. And how we do that is really, really complicated, because I think it does need policy. It needs action from consumers as well, but I think that it needs to be steered by policy too. So it's a muddle, and you know, most farmers, most large farmers who are growing commodity crops will by default be supplying supermarkets one way or another, either through a big plant bakery or through protein or oil crops. And it's you know, it's unique really in Western Europe, that we should have our retail, our grocery, you know, 95% plus of all of our grocery purchases happen in those, you know, half a dozen big box retailers. And it's quite extraordinary. And it's quite extraordinary to see them using their land banks and their cash reserves in order to disrupt any potential challenges, whether that's online retail or whether it's smaller retailers. You know, they all moved out of town and killed the high street, then they moved back to the high street to finish it off properly. And I do find that quite challenging, quite difficult. I don't have any answers, I'm afraid.
I think Dougal had also put in the chat, what's the closest we can get to a Heinz baked bean in the UK?
Okay, so Heinz baked beans. Heinz are really interesting. So there they are. They're the most kind of iconic, kind of British seeming food, but they're not at all. You know, they're a thing that came over, you know, in the early 20th century. They were a luxury food. They had pork in them usually. They're based on those Boston baked bean recipes, and of course they use these chaps, navy beans, which we tried growing here, and there are others trying to grow them here as well, but they don't really grow here very well. They're not very well adapted. They're quite a thick-skinned bean because they've been bred for canning. They're not actually a very nice bean if you just eat them like this. They all come from the Great Lakes area, and Heinz bring them over and they can them with tomato sauce. So you could make some with some that you grew in your garden, and that would be very close. We make a baked bean which is nothing like Heinz baked beans. Which isn't really an answer to your question. So we've tried canning whole fava beans. We use Maris B because they're quite small, and we make them we do them in a tomato sauce, but they're nothing like Heinz baked beans. They're radically different. They're more like the North African full madamas, and in fact, if you add some cumin and some spices, that's essentially what they become.
What about the Lottie beans? Are they not similar to baked beans?
So there are old world beans and there are new world beans. There are a number of different globally. There are a number of different species of bean that we eat. There's the vineyard beans, which are things like aduki beans and mung beans. There's the Phaseolus beans, which divide into two groups, or three really. Phaseolus vulgaris, so that's French beans and the beans that you might grow in your garden. Phaseolus coccineus, which are runner beans, they're tall beans. And actually in Central and South America, where they originate from, they're actually a perennial, they're a vine, and they grow up into the trees, and they're pollinated by hummingbirds, which is rather romantic, isn't it, when you see them growing in your garden. And then there's one other group, which is Phaseolus lunatus, which is butter beans. And all of those beans come from the New World, from the Americas, and they came over really when we discovered the Americas, although they'd obviously previously been discovered, and beans have been domesticated there. And we brought those beans back, and because they were new and they were difficult to grow and they were higher status, they replaced a lot of the pulses that we'd previously been eating in Europe. So things like lentils and chickpeas, fava beans, and peas. And borlotti beans fall into that category. So they come from the south of North America, and they were brought over to the particular varieties in the late 19th century, and then obviously became very, very popular. And you can grow those at home. They're difficult to grow on a field scale, but growing them at home and harvesting some beans for green, which you can eat, during the summer, and then leaving some pods to mature, and either harvesting them when the pods are kind of leathery and they're very dry and storing them as a dry bean, or harvesting them when the pods are just starting to go leathery, when they're demi-sec, semi-dry, and they cook very quickly, but they have a lot of the amino acid and flavor benefits of a fully dried bean.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Chris Bias has said, again, that's very interesting. Are there any crops you're looking for that can be grown just north of the Humber? He's not organic.
So it's quite interestingly, one of the big problems that we've had with fava beans, which I'm sure everyone's very painfully aware of, is bruchid infestation, and the gradual march north of bruchid beetles over the last 15 or 20 years has meant that we've retreated north as well with the farmers that we work with. So we tend to buy fava beans from north of the Humber. That is our rule of thumb. So that is a crop, and we do buy quite a lot of non-organic fava beans. So that's something that's potentially interesting. Bruchid is increasingly a problem even further north now, and we're sort of backing into Scotland to find beans that have a very low incidence, and we're working with a group of farmers up there. But yeah, if you had beans would be a good thing for us. If you had a sample that looked good, that's something that we'd definitely be interested in. I mean, there are probably other crops as well, but that would work. Lentils, I think, would be pushing it. Quinoa is definitely pushing it as well. But yeah, there are, I'm sure, other things that would work depending on exactly where you are north of the Humber. Send us an email is the answer.
I was going to say, I think we'll be passing your contact details on. We've got a lot of members in the north of the country and in Scotland, funnily enough, so they might be interested to know that you're looking for crops.
So we've been trialling lentils in Scotland, actually, having found that there is some reference historically to lentil production in Scotland as far north as the Northern Isles, which is quite surprising because one thinks of them as rather tender, but we've had some moderate success with trials.
That's really interesting. Elizabeth is saying, Josiah, thank you. I'm buzzing in thought. I have been part of the Scottish Pulses group with the James Hutton Institute and the Soil Association, and the stumbling block in Scotland appears to be, or perceived, hold on a sec, can't get my thing to scroll now, perceived to be processing, building demand and volume retailing. I'm excited to be growing small quantities of non-commodity crops, but finding lots of time to build relationships is, I think, holding me back. I'm a solo farmer and I need to invest in these relationships to move forward. Positive relationships with others in the chain are essential. Are Hodmedods, Hodmedods apprenticeships or education programs required?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. They may be. I mean, part of our role really is as an enabler, which is in that it is really difficult for farmers to make all those relationships themselves, whereas they can form a relationship with us, they can join our farmer group, and we have that sort of shared communication and knowledge exchange and things. It's quite small, there's about 30 farmers. and introduce people in that way. So, if Elizabeth Massey wanted to have a chat, then I'd be really happy to do that. We work with 5 or 6 farmers in Scotland on pulses. It's not impossible. So all our organic green peas this year have been grown in Scotland. We have got the Balcaski estate growing fava beans for us this year, and our lentil trials obviously been happening in Scotland. So, and we're quite engaged with the research community up there. And I'm visiting Scotland to visit the farmers that we work with in April. So maybe she should send me an email.
Definitely putting your email address out there. Dougal is asking, does the brucid beetle damage really make the bean completely unusable?
Yes and no. So for whole beans, it does, because not all the beans emerge, or not all the beetles emerge, and our customers are really fussy and they just don't like beetles in their beans. And the problem with the beetles is they creep out into the bags, and it's unappealing. Obviously, it's just a quality issue. There's no food risk associated with eating them. It's just a bit of extra protein, but we do struggle with that. When we're splitting them, the problem we have is that it generates a lot of waste. So if the bruchid incident is high and they go through a needling drum and then they're split, we get a lot of cotyledon damage as a consequence of the beetle's activity, and we get quite high waste, and that can be problematic. Holes in the beans, holes in the split beans, they're a problem for the export market, who are very, very particular. But the UK domestic market isn't so fussy because they don't really know what those holes mean. so we don't really have a problem with holes in split beans. But we are being increasingly kind of bold about what level of bruchid damage we'll accept. So and we've dealt with some quite high bruchid incidents this year, and touch wood, it hasn't been too bad. There's always a risk of a beetle or grub left in a cotyledon that hasn't gone through sorting. But for things like flour, we make a lot of bean flour. It's not really a problem at all. It's just because each load that we have will have multiple end uses. We have to try and balance that all out.
Another one from me, Josiah, if I can. You and I both sat in on a really interesting webinar a couple of weeks ago, probably on bicropping, Scandinavian business who he and his brother ran an organic farm, but a really interesting seed cleaning business. And certainly looking at the figures of the investment, I sort of held my hands up in horror and thought, gosh, there's a huge investment there. But when you worked out how many days a year he was cleaning and the throughput of that plant, it clearly stacked up, didn't it? Is there an equivalent in this country? Are there lots of, we know from a previous base webinar that with Scott MacArthur from MacArthur Agriculture, there are farmers doing that sort of thing, but do you see that there's demand for a similar business to the one that we saw on the webinar in the UK?
So we watched a farmer called Per Modic, who's in who's in the southern part of Sweden, Skåne County, and we've been to see him. We've taken our farmer group to see him. I've been to see him a couple of times actually. He's absolutely fascinating and fantastic, and a real innovator in these niche and novel crops. Learn a lot from him. And he has established a very small scale cleaning plant to deal with very small quantities of pulses and some grains. And I think in Scandinavia, interestingly, particularly in Sweden, there's actually very limited capacity for grain cleaning. We're quite lucky, particularly in East Anglia. We've still got quite a few smaller scale grain cleaners who can take lower volumes, less than full loads. And we make use of those. But I think there is scope for smaller scale processing to happen, particularly on the trial crops, where the cleaning costs can be really, really significant because we have to do multiple passes, for example, in order to get something to the spec that we want. And I mean, we're looking at getting we're talking to Scott MacArthur as it happens actually, about getting some smaller scale equipment, which would allow us to clean crops from a number of farms together. So that sort of, essentially that's sort of spreads the capital expenditure. I think there is it is tricky, isn't it? If every farm wants to set up its own cleaning plant, there's a lot of capital expenditure, and where does it go after then? And I think we need to think sort of perhaps beyond the farm gate a bit and think about more collaborative models for doing that. Per's model works for him because he's the only farmer in the whole of that area that's doing that particular thing. But if another farmer, if his neighbour decides to do it, it would make no sense for the neighbour to also buy the same equipment. It'd be much more sensible for him to work with Per Modic and use some of the cleaning equipment he's got. So yeah, I do think I think small scale actually, or smaller scale more broadly, is really interesting. Whether it's machinery and the sort of tackle they might be using, all the way through to grain cleaning. If we're going to look at these diversified models, sometimes that means actually. It means smaller kit, smaller fields, and smaller capacity and equipment. And that doesn't necessarily mean lower return. It can mean a higher value return, but it is a risk, I think.
Perhaps we could put the link. I think the link is public. Yeah, the video is publicly available. I'm not sure whether you had to register to be able to watch it or not. But if the link works publicly, perhaps we could put it on the links on the base website, because it was. I only came in at the end of it the first time and then watched it on Watch Again. It was really interesting to see what that guy was doing.
Yeah, he's great. He always says he can't speak English, and then he speaks English brilliantly. But yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think some of the solutions that he's found, he's doing it. I don't know how clear it was in the video, but he's doing that in a very, very small space, and relatively speaking, it's quite high output. And because he's selling those beans, he sells some of them into a business called Nordisk Råvara, which is very much like Hodmedod, but in Sweden, and some of it he sells directly at farmers markets and at the farm gates. And so there's a really good return, and he employs a guy, I think almost full time, who does the cleaning, and he employs a couple of people that are doing the packing, it's just an excellent way for him to add value to his farm business. The farm itself is exemplary as well. You should, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Sweden, which I recommend anyway, it is a fascinating visit.
Well, we're always looking. Well, we've got a list of places we want to visit at the moment, because for the last 2 years we haven't been able to. But certainly, if we can arrange something over there at some point, I'm sure you'll be able to perhaps do some introductions for us, and we'd be pleased to go.
Absolutely.
Any more hands up, Rebecca?
No, I haven't got any more hands. I've got another chat though. Hold on. Then Google again.
Yeah. So the answer is yes, potentially. Dougal in all cases. So lupin is a fantastic food because it's very high in fat, in sort of good fat, or whatever you want to call it, which a lot of plant foods aren't. It's high in protein as well, and particularly the new varieties that are not bitter and are good for human consumption. They taste good, and they can be made. I've been to Germany, had this amazing lupin ice cream, which sounds bizarre. Probably is bizarre, but tastes amazing. The problem we've always had with it is quite marginal in the UK, in our climate. But the main problem is it's one of the 14 allergens that is listed and has to have an on-pack warning. And because it's not a food that's handled in the UK by processors, no one wants to add another allergen to the list. So where we've always struggled is if we want to take it to a grain cleaner and then we tell them it's lupins and it's an allergen, they don't want to tell all of their other customers that they're now handling this allergen. And that's been a real pain for us. In a way, having our own way of cleaning it would resolve that, although we'd then have to make that allergen declaration. It would take a dedicated cleaning plant, essentially, to resolve some of those issues. And when Nordisk Råvara, the Swedish version of Hodmedods I was talking about earlier, started to do lupin, initially they were sending their lupins to Germany to be cleaned and then bringing them back, just in order to begin to develop that market. They now have one of their farmers has set up a dedicated loop and cleaning plant on his farm and does all of the loop and cleaning for all the growers, but it hasn't been particularly easy for them. Clover, there's definitely a human consumption market for clover. It's used a lot as a substitute for alfalfa in sprout mixes, and it's good to eat, but it's not good to grow. It's a nightmare to grow, isn't it? If anyone's grown clover seed, you really need the seed value return in order to make it worthwhile, because the human consumption value is not as high as the seed sale into cover crop. Most clover for human consumption is grown in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. They grow a huge quantity of it. They've got big economies of scale and they've got a better climate than us. Vetch is really interesting. So vetch is obviously it's a wild relative of the peas and beans that we eat. It does have a neurotoxin in it, which means that if you were to subsist off vetch, you would become very, very ill. And at low levels, you know, if you've got vetch in your milling wheat, if you're an organic farm, I'm sure you'll have had that happen. That's actually fine. You just mill it and eat it. But vetch is difficult to sell exclusively for consumption, because if someone was to eat too much of it, they'll get these problems. There was a big problem in India with food fraud, where a split vetch seed looks very much like a lentil, and some canny Australian farmers had identified this export opportunity for a much higher yielding crop than a lentil, and they were selling them into India. And the problem there was that a lot of people in India completely subsist on lentils, and so they were getting quite ill from eating them, and that led to a crackdown in the trade and export of vetch from Australia. So it's a tricky one, really. I've eaten vetch. It's not unpleasant, but I think you just need to be a bit wary. There are lots of other pulses as well that we don't really grow in the UK, but that we probably could. One of the ones I think is really interesting, it's not technically a pulse, is peanuts. Peanuts are grown in the southern states of the US, and they're thought, one tends to think of them as quite, liking quite balmy conditions, and they do like heat, but they do grow in the UK, and there are varieties that will grow here. And it would be really interesting to look at a little bit of peanut production and see whether we could grow them on a small scale, really more as a demonstration crop than anything else. They're not probably quite tricky for regenerative farmers, because there's a lot of soil disturbance because they push the pods into the soil. Someone's asking about Austrian pumpkin seed oil, which is very nice indeed. So we are working with a farmer on pumpkin seeds. We've got pumpkin seeds this year. We've got about a ton first harvest. He's bought an oil press, and he's going to make pumpkin oil, and we're going to sell the seeds as a whole crop. It's not without its challenges, as you can imagine. But in principle, they grow very well here. It's just a question of how you handle the harvest and the post-harvest. There's a lot of handling, a lot of work involved.
Is there a particular variety that works best for pumpkin?
So there are three main groups of pumpkin. There's ones without a seed coat, ones with a seed. Well, there are two types without a seed coat. There's a Greek variety and there's the Austrian variety, and they were kind of natural mutations that were spotted in the 19th century. And the Styrian pumpkins are the ones that make the Austrian pumpkin seed oil, and they're really delicious. And the Chinese have a variety that has a seed coat, but it's relatively easily removed. And so if you see the small pumpkin seeds that you'll see in seed mixes and things, the little sort of lighter green, more khaki green ones, they're the ones that are grown with skins, and the skins are removed. And then the larger, bigger, flatter ones, almost fingernail size, are the Styrian type naked pumpkin seeds.
Thank you. I only asked because my daughter-in-law's father is a pumpkin grower, so I just thought they might be interested to know that.
Yeah, it's worth a try. Unfortunately, the flesh is really not worth eating. It's just the seeds, so you produce a lot of compost.
Yes, they do. don't think there's any more questions on the chat at the moment, David.
Let me unmute myself. Okay. Well, if you've got no more questions, it gives me great pleasure to thank you this evening, Josiah. That was fascinating. I'm immensely impressed by your knowledge of seeds and varieties of anything that we've discussed, whether it's lentils, peas, beans, or pumpkin seeds even, on top of clearly your other skill sets from your previous life before Hodmedods. So really fascinating. Thank you for doing that for us this evening. I'm sure you'll be getting some emails from some of the people posing questions earlier. And I think if any of us, because more of us are used to growing unusual things now, if we've started growing our own cover crop seed and other bits and pieces, growing a small area of something which is far from the norm on the farm has become the norm now. And for somebody to do a couple of hectares of something for the likes of yourselves and Hodmedods, I don't see that as being unusual, and perhaps something that we'll all be wanting to do more of in the future. So thank you for a fascinating evening.
No problem. It's, I'm interested to hear that people are now growing their own cover crop seeds as well, because it seems like such an opportunity. It's expensive, and
and once you get it set up where you've got a bit of drying apparatus in a tote bin, the bottom of a pedestal mounted in the bottom of a tote bin with a fan, 4-inch fan on the side, and introduce a little bit of heat from that, and you can dry a ton or a ton and a half over a couple of days. It's not a huge investment to get set up to handle these small amounts of different crops now. So it's all doable.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's often just a question of stepping back and thinking again, and everything is geared to tonnage, isn't it? And sometimes it's difficult to look at the fiddly crops, but they do add a lot of interest as well as value.
They do. They make for a great farm walk, and make the farming life certainly more interesting than just growing wheat, barley, and oilseed rape, don't they?
Yeah, I often feel that farmers over the last 70 years, really post-war, there's been this kind of reduction. Farmers have a fantastic, incredible broad skill set from plant science and engineering through to soil science and marketing, and they do all these different things, and yet we've spent sort of 30 years reducing that down to a set of field processes that are dictated by a machinery manufacturer, a seed supplier, an end customer, who'll even send you the invoice and tell you how much you're going to be paid. And it just seems insane that all these skills are going to waste, and that the people who know the land that they're working the best are often disempowered. And re-empowering people, even if it's just by growing 2 hectares of lentils, and giving that bit of interest back, and helping people to, I think with the first farmer that we bought wheat from, and we baked a loaf and took him the bread, and he'd never eaten bread from his own grain store before. It was it's kind of like, I'm growing food. It's like, yes.
As you know, I can go for England on my lunchtime loaf experiences, and it's certainly not a flash in the pan. And yesterday's lunchtime loaf was Hawkmill Farm blended of 3 varieties wholemeal loaf, and it was done at 12:30 and consumed at 1 o'clock, and it was fantastic. So
yeah, good.
So thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Just to let everyone know, members wise, that we have a meeting next Thursday on herbal grass lays. So hope to see you at 7 p.m. next week as well. And then we will probably take a break for a little while, because you'll all get busy on your drills and lambing and all the rest of it. So thank you, David, and thank you, Josiah.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.